English Language and Composition students, welcome to Lesson 54. This is our second multiple choice practice test, part 4. But we're on the ending the third passage right now. So I was explaining, I'm just going to go into this question a little bit. They refer to these lines. So you have to go back, right? So you go back in there and you see lines 33, 34, what does it say? Historians and anthropologists frankly throw up their hands and admit that they can't define family in a way that works universally. They can't define family in a way that works universally. That idea, there's no set meaning for family over time, is reflected in these lines when Humpty Dumpty says in the first paragraph, family means what I say it means. It's like, oh, just whatever you say it means someone else will say something else. So it's not set. We're supposed to get that from that. But I'm going to move kind of quickly here. The next question, 29, is very important for your understanding because there are always footnote questions on the AP test, as I said before. Footnote 6. Mostly all of our footnotes are secondary sources. That means the information has been reinterpreted, right? So it's not just, if something is census data, some census that was taken, or an original document that hasn't been reinterpreted, and that information on the census hasn't been reinterpreted. So the Declaration of Independence, if it were cited, it's a primary source. But most everything we're going to have is secondary. So footnote 6 is not primary, it's secondary. That's why that's the answer. The author uses a lot of parentheticals. For instance, let's see if I can find it here. Oh, like Romans didn't consider birth the only way to acquire offspring, just as they felt free to expose, and then in parentheses, in other words, kill. So she's saying, oh, you think expose just means left out in the open? No, it means to kill, all right? And nearly all adoptions were of grown men, and then she puts in parentheses, yes, men. So she's anticipating that the reader will not really understand or accept. So she's trying to clarify so that they accept her kind of strange points. I already went over 31. In that footnote, 2, remember we had the two authors that are referred to, like Dixon and Treggiari. So it was confusing. There was ambiguity on who the author was, so that's why the answer is for footnote 2. And then my final question here. Which of the following was not critical in the evolution of the definition of family? Blood. Blood did not determine family. I went over this before in the previous video. It doesn't have to do with S-A-N-G means blood in French, Latin, in Spanish, sangre. So we should know that. We have to have a broad knowledge to do well in this test. Now we're going on to the next section, the next passage. Well, it's a little bit of a difficult passage. I like the last passage the best. So this is the next to the last passage. It is by our American philosopher from the first part of the 19th century, Ralph Waldo Emerson, the transcendentalist. That was the idea of his philosophy. But anyway, he's speaking at a university. Well, that is a university in England, but he's speaking about American colleges and scholars. So what do we get in this passage, if you don't remember? 3 paragraphs. The first one is about reading. So the American scholar reads. So we do have the scholar reading, and the idea is that we have an identity of all minds, the writer with the reader, so that even though we can read from British British authors from the 14th century and the 17th century, early, and probably 17th century too, even though they're so old. So these are allusions to British authors, allusions, references. Even though they were a long time ago, time is erased, all right? So we get the idea that time is erased. They lie close to our own souls. There's an identity of all minds, right? Time is erased, and there is a harmony. We think the same, all right? But he ends this paragraph with equating reading information that was written for us to taking in food that was stored up, okay? Food that is laid up for us by these authors, and we are insects that are taking in this information as an insect. We, the readers, as an insect would some food that was laid up for it. So that's, you could call it an analogy, but it's a metaphor. So there's a question on how does he convey his information? Through allusions and metaphors. Right? We'll remember that when we go to that question. The second paragraph, it's a little bit of a strange paragraph. Again, he's going into reading is eating, right? And there is a question about this too. Yes, what is the diet referring back to? So many of our questions are antecedent questions. They are, what does this word refer back to? What is the diet? The printed page. Well, you know, you have to start looking backwards when there's an antecedent question, right? A strong head to bear that diet. Heads don't eat, brains don't eat literally, so it's figurative, it's a metaphor, but we mentally take in what's on the printed page as we also take in food through our mouth. So that's the analogy. It's extended from the paragraph before. But then he goes into, you have to be, to read well, you have to be very creative, right? He repeats that. The idea is creative through these words, but he also has the word creative. That means you have to be an active reader, and you have to be discerning, right? Okay, so you have to be a creative reader, thinking about what's on the page, what's important, what's not. Because what's on the page is very important, and we have the word oracle and the word seer, so some sort of visionary, some sort of prophet wrote the stuff, and you have to be discerning to take in what's important. That's what's going on there. In the last paragraph, he does switch subtopics, even though it's about the American scholar as an individual who's studying and how to do that well. Now he switches to the institutions of scholarship, American colleges, even though he's speaking overseas, probably in England. But anyway, what makes a good college? Again, he does have an overlap from the paragraph before about being creative. The scholar has to be creative in his or her way he reads, or the way she reads, but so do the institutions. They can't be dry and boring. They have to be creative and, you know, stimulate the wit, right? And he uses the word wit in there. So there's a question about, well, I will read this sentence. Gowns and pecuniary foundations, financial foundations, gowns like you graduate and you wear a gown in the commencement. Though these are, you know, impressive and important, they can't compensate for, this word means, the least sentence or syllable of wit. So what study is the essence of all the universities, colleges. That has to be the essential, not the outward trappings of the university or what supports it, that behind the scenes. So this is outward, external, this is behind the scenes in a way. What's important is the learning. And so there's a question about forget this, forget what? Well, you go to what's before, but what's this idea? Forget this and American colleges will recede. So what do we have to remember? American colleges to be good. Not this, but this. So there, you do have to jump back to the next idea that this refers to, not just what came before. So thought and knowledge, that's what's the essence of scholarship. Not stuff on the surface and attitudes and so on. So there is a question about that. And it ends with a paradox. Forget this. No, it's sort of like opposites together. If we do forget this, the colleges will diminish while growing richer. It is sort of paradoxical, though. All right. Our questions. Hopefully I went over a lot of them just by looking at the passage, so I don't have to spend a lot of time here. Oracle, we also had the word seer, someone looking into the future. The diet refers back to letter E, the printed page. I went over that. Let's go on. The speaker characterizes the great writers that were mentioned in the first paragraph as being able to present universal truths. Right? They bridged time. That was the idea there. The next one, you do have to look at the passage really to get it. So in paragraph 1, I'll just go back there myself and relate it to you. The author says, when this poet, he's talking about himself, no, he's talking about the other writers. When this poet who lived in some past world 200 or 300 years ago says that which lies close to my own soul, that which I also had well-nigh thought and said. So he says something that I agree with, but which I also thought and said. So he feels validated. That old writer said something, wrote something I feel the same about. Validated. The tone. There's always a lot of tone questions, aren't there? He is determining what makes good colleges, what makes good scholars. And so he's digging into the details. It's being very evaluative, all right? He's evaluating. That's a type of analysis, right? So the next one's pretty easy. You don't even have to look back at the passage. If you look at all these, you see in letter B, like. That's a simile. Fed, not literal, it's figurative. It's figurative language. And that diet, it's figurative language. And in this last one, it ends with towns of gold. There are no towns of gold. It's all figurative. So this one, though, is straightforward. It's not figurative. Everything is literally true here. Okay. Let's go on to number 39. Right. 39 was easy. The reader can infer, it's not stated, but you can figure out that the author desires that these institutions shouldn't rely on appearances. They shouldn't rely on outward trappings like gowns and so on. That's not what makes them important and efficient, effective, right? So that's why we get that idea, from the gowns especially. Number 40, I went through that before. Letter E. No, it's letter C. Okay. The pronoun this, refers back to thought and knowledge. Oh yes, remember, there was a sentence that